My name is Elena. I'm 48 years old, and for most of my life, I've been content with simplicity. My days are predictable. Mornings with tea and a book, afternoons editing manuscripts for my freelance work, and evenings spent on long walks through familiar streets. It's a life of quiet routine, devoid of surprises but comfortable in its steadiness. I hadn't given much thought to romance in years. That chapter of my life felt closed, sealed by time and circumstance. I had loved deeply once, but as the years passed, so too did the sense that love could find me again. It was a Wednesday when everything began to change. I'd stopped by a small café near the park, one of my favorite places to spend an afternoon. The air was thick with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the faint hum of quiet conversation created a soothing backdrop. I had just settled into my usual corner table, my notebook open in front of me when I saw him. He walked in with an easy confidence, a presence that seemed to ripple through the room. He wasn't loud or imposing, but there was something magnetic about him. His dark hair curled slightly at the edges, his smile was effortless, and his eyes held a warmth that seemed to draw people in. I caught myself staring, my pen hovering uselessly over the blank page of my notebook. It had been so long since someone had caught my attention like that, so long since I'd felt the quiet thrill of being intrigued by a stranger. I thought it would pass, that I'd go back to my tea and my notes and forget him as soon as he left. But as I watched him sip his coffee, flipping through the pages of a book, I felt something stir inside me, a strange mix of curiosity and longing. Before I knew it, the thought had taken hold. Who is he? When he left the cafe that day, I made a choice that felt both impulsive and absurd. I followed him, not in a dramatic way, but quietly, from a distance, weaving through the crowd as he walked. He stopped by a bookstore, browsed for a while, then continued to the park. The next day I did the same. And the day after that, I don't know what I was looking for. Answers, perhaps, or an understanding of why he had captivated me so completely. Each time I saw him, my heart would race, my thoughts tangled in a mix of excitement and self-reproach. What was I doing? What did I hope to find? Yet I couldn't stop. For those 3 days, I became a silent observer of his world. I noticed how he smiled at strangers, how he lingered by the fountain in the park as if lost in thought. There was something gentle about him, something that made me feel like he carried a quiet depth beneath his easy demeanor. I hadn't realized it yet, but those 3 days would be the start of something that would change my life forever. To be why the third day, I had convinced myself that this little obsession would pass. It had to. I couldn't keep trailing a stranger through the city like a character in one of the novels I edited. It was reckless, and frankly, beneath the composed woman I believed myself to be. But that day, something shifted. I had stationed myself at the cafe again, pretending to read while I waited for him to arrive. It had become part of the strange ritual I didn't dare to question. When he finally walked in, his presence seemed to fill the room, just as it had the first time. But this time he noticed me. I wasn't sure at first. It was subtle. A quick glance in my direction as he ordered his coffee, his gaze lingering just a moment too long before he looked away. My breath caught, and I tried to focus on the book in front of me, but I could feel his eyes on me again, fleeting and cautious. It wasn't until he sat down, not far from my usual corner, that the connection became undeniable. I caught him looking at me twice more, his expression soft, almost curious. Each time he offered a small smile, not overtly flirtatious but warm, as if to say, "I see you." My chest tightened, my heart thudding against my ribs. I hadn't felt this kind of attention in years, and it was both exhilarating and terrifying. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, just a coincidence. But as the hours passed and I watched him from behind my book, I began to notice other small signs. How he seemed to position himself so that I was within his line of sight, how he lingered over his coffee longer than usual. When he left the cafe that day, I decided I couldn't follow him again. Not this time. I had to break the spell before it consumed me. But as I sat there, trying to calm the storm of emotions swirling inside me, I saw him pause just outside the window. He turned back toward the cafe, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on me. For a moment we locked eyes, and the intensity of it sent a shiver down my spine. Then he smiled, wider this time more certain, and gave a small nod before walking away. That smile stayed with me all night, haunting me with its quiet promise. Had he noticed me before? Was it possible that the connection I felt wasn't one-sided after all? I replayed the day in my mind. Every glance, every smile, dissecting each moment until I couldn't be sure what was real and what was imagined. But one thought stood out above all the others. What if he feels it too? I couldn't ignore it anymore. Whatever this was, whatever it meant, I knew I had to find out. And so, against every rational instinct, I decided to take the next step, to bridge the gap between us before it was too late. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of determination. The unease and self-doubt that had plagued me for days were still there, but now they were laced with a quiet resolve. I couldn't keep living in this liminal space, torn between curiosity and fear. I had to act. I arrived at the café earlier than usual, my heart pounding in anticipation. I wasn't sure he'd show up. There was always the chance he wouldn't, that my bold plans would collapse before they even began. But when the door swung open and he walked in, my breath caught. He was wearing a navy jacket that seemed to complement the easy confidence in his stride. His gaze swept the room, landing on me for the briefest moment before a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. He ordered his coffee as he always did, but this time he didn't take his usual seat. He walked straight toward me. For a second I panicked. My thoughts raced. What do I say? What does he want? But as he approached, I noticed the warmth in his eyes, the openness in his expression, and I knew I didn't have to overthink it. Mind if I sit here? He asked, his voice smooth but unassuming. I nodded. My words caught somewhere between my throat and my heart. I've noticed you here a few times, he said, his smile widening. I'm Damien, by the way. Elena, I replied, my voice steadier than I expected. The conversation began with the usual pleasantries, but it quickly deepened. He asked about my work, my interests, and I found myself opening up in ways I hadn't in years. He listened intently, his attention never wavering, and when he spoke, his words were thoughtful, revealing a curious mind and a kind heart. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't just being seen, I was being understood. When it was time to leave, I couldn't let the moment slip away. My palms were damp, and my heart raced as I gathered my courage. Damien, I said, my voice faltering slightly. I don't usually do this, but would you like to come over for dinner sometime? He blinked, surprised, and for a moment, I worried I'd overstepped. But then he smiled, a smile that reached his eyes and filled me with an inexplicable warmth. I'd love to, he said. We exchanged numbers, and as I left the cafe, my hands shook with a mixture of excitement and nerves. I had done it. I had invited him into my world, and now there was no turning back. That evening, as I prepared for our dinner, I couldn't stop the stream of thoughts rushing through my mind. What would he think of my home? Of me? Would he see through the carefully curated image I had tried to project and discover the vulnerability beneath? But amid the whirlwind of anxiety, there was also hope. Hope that this moment, this connection, could be the start of something extraordinary. When the doorbell rang, my heart felt like it might leap out of my chest. I smoothed down the front of my dress, a simple navy number that felt both understated and elegant, and took a steadying breath before opening the door. There he was, Damien, standing on my porch with a bottle of wine in one hand and a bouquet of pale lilies in the other. For you, he said, smiling warmly. I hope I'm not too early. I laughed softly, shaking my head. Perfect timing. Come in. The evening unfolded like a dream. We talked over dinner, roast chicken with rosemary potatoes, a meal I had poured my nervous energy into preparing. Conversation flowed as easily as the wine, each word peeling back another layer between us. Damien shared stories about his travels, his work as a photographer, and the way he saw beauty in the smallest, simplest moments. I told him about my love for literature, how words had always been my anchor, and how I had stumbled upon the quiet life I now led. I have to admit, he said after a moment of comfortable silence, I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk like this. I tilted my head, intrigued. Why is that? You have this way about you, he said, his voice soft. Like you see the world differently. There's a kind of stillness in you, but not in a quiet way. More like depth. I looked down, suddenly self-conscious under his gaze. I didn't think anyone noticed. Well, I did, he said with a small smile. As the night wore on, we moved to the living room, settling on the couch with our glasses of wine. The space between us felt charged, every glance and touch carrying an unspoken tension. I wasn't sure who moved first, but suddenly he was closer, his hand brushing against mine. When he looked at me, his eyes were filled with something I couldn't quite name, something tender, but also undeniably intense. "Elena," he murmured, his voice a mix of hesitation and longing. "I don't want to overstep, but—" "You're not," I whispered, cutting him off. And then, as if the moment had been waiting for us all along, our lips met. It wasn't rushed or hesitant. It was the kind of kiss that spoke volumes, of curiosity, of passion, of the quiet understanding that something profound was unfolding between us. In that moment, the years between us melted away. It didn't matter that I was older, or that I had spent so long convincing myself that this kind of connection was no longer possible. All that mattered was him here now. The night deepened, and so did our bond. As we moved closer, I felt something within me awaken, something I had thought was long buried. It was more than just a physical connection. It was as though Damien saw the parts of me I had tried to hide, the pieces I had forgotten how to share. And instead of shying away, he embraced them. By the time dawn began to filter through the curtains, I realized I wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in years, I felt alive, seen, and understood in a way I hadn't thought possible. And as Damien's arms wrapped around me, pulling me close, I allowed myself to believe that this moment, this man, could be the start of something truly extraordinary. The morning light bathed the room in soft gold, and for a moment, I just lay there, trying to absorb the stillness. Damien was still asleep beside me, his breathing steady and calm, his arm draped over my waist as though even in slumber he couldn't let go. I turned slightly to look at him, taking in the relaxed lines of his face, the faint smile that lingered even now. It was as though he belonged here, as though the space next to me had always been waiting for him. But as the haze of the night began to clear, doubts started to creep in. What would people think? A woman nearing 50, involved with a man who was, 10, 15 years younger? Was I setting myself up for heartbreak by daring to believe in this? I slipped out of bed quietly, not wanting to disturb him, and made my way to the kitchen. As I brewed a pot of coffee, my mind raced with questions I couldn't answer. The intensity of what we had shared the night before was undeniable, but could it be sustained? "Morning," Damien's voice broke through my thoughts, soft and warm. I turned to find him leaning against the doorway, his hair tousled, his eyes still heavy with sleep. He looked impossibly at ease, as though he had always belonged in my home and my life. "Good morning," I said, smiling despite myself. He crossed the room, placing a hand gently on my shoulder before leaning in to press a kiss to my cheek. "You okay?" "Just thinking," I admitted, pouring us both a cup of coffee. "About?" he prompted, his gaze steady and patient. I hesitated, then decided to be honest. "About us. About what this means. About whether this can work." He nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "I've thought about that too. Last night wasn't something I took lightly, Elena. I know we come from different places, different lives, but that doesn't change how I feel." "And how do you feel?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I've found someone I don't want to let go of," he said simply. His words settled over me like a warm blanket, easing some of the tension that had been building in my chest. Still, I couldn't help but voice my fears. But what about the age difference? What about what people will say? Damien stepped closer, his hands gently cradling my face as he looked into my eyes. "What other people think doesn't matter. What matters is how we feel. And I feel like you've woken something in me, something I didn't even realize I was missing." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, and I let out a shaky laugh. "I don't know what to say to that." "You don't have to say anything," he said, smiling softly. "Just, let's see where this takes us. No expectations, no pressure. Just you and me." In that moment, I realized how much I wanted that. To let go of my fears and simply allow myself to feel, to hope, to love. The rest of the day passed in a blur of quiet moments and easy laughter. Damien stayed, helping me prepare lunch, sharing stories from his life, and listening to mine with the kind of attention that made me feel like the most important person in the world. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt alive, cherished, and seen. And as the sun set and Damien kissed me goodbye, promising to call soon, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of our story. It was only the beginning. Weeks passed, and yet, with every passing day, I found myself more and more captivated by Damien. Our connection had only deepened. What began as a quiet curiosity had blossomed into something far more profound, something neither of us had expected but both of us needed. I could feel it in the way we spoke, in the way we laughed together, and in the way we could sit in silence and still feel entirely comfortable with one another. The age difference, once so daunting to me, had faded into the background, irrelevant in the face of the raw honesty and emotion we shared. We didn't rush anything. We simply allowed ourselves to be. And in doing so, I rediscovered parts of myself I had long buried. Damien's presence in my life had given me a kind of freedom I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I no longer felt the need to prove anything to anyone, not to society, not even to myself. What mattered was the love we were building, quietly but steadfastly, without the noise of judgment or expectation. One afternoon, as we sat on the park bench where we had first met, I turned to him, my heart full of emotion. "I never imagined my life would turn out like this," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I thought those days were behind me, but with you, I feel like I've been given a second chance." Damien looked at me, his eyes soft with understanding. "You've always had that chance, Elena. It just took a little longer for you to see it." Tears welled in my eyes, and I smiled, overwhelmed by the truth in his words. He had given me the courage to believe in something I had long since given up on, love, and the possibility of starting again, regardless of age, of past mistakes, of all the things that might have stood in the way. We didn't have all the answers. We didn't need them. What we had was enough for now. A shared understanding, a quiet joy in each other's company, and the promise that we would continue to explore this beautiful, unexpected bond together. As I kissed him that evening, in the soft glow of the setting sun, I felt a deep sense of peace settle in my chest. This wasn't just a romance. This was a rediscovery of who I was, who I could be, and it was just the beginning. So as I walked hand in hand with Damien through the quiet streets of our city, I didn't feel old. I didn't feel past my prime. I felt alive and I felt loved. And for the first time in years, I felt like the woman I had always wanted to be.